Hello and welcome. Today we will be looking into how to create a virtual reality scene using Unreal 4. And for this basically tutorial series, you will require the following things. You will require Unreal 4, which is available for free by the Epic Games Launcher, which can be downloaded on PC and Mac. You will need a virtual reality unit. Today we'll be utilizing the Oculus Developer Kit 2 only because we've got one lying around at this moment in time, but this could be a HTC Vive or an Oculus Consumer Edition or Gear VR. The same principles apply to all three. So the first thing you want to do is launch your Epic Games Launcher. So we have loaded up. As you see, I'm already signed in. Today we'll be utilising, if you're using an Oculus DK2, which we're using today, we need to utilise 4.10.4. Although if you're using the HTC Vive or Consumer Editions, newer versions would be sufficient. So we'll launch that up. It's worth noting that to rebuild a virtual reality scene, a fairly decent computer spec is recommended. So here we go. What we'll do is, for the purposes of this tutorial series, we'll start with start content, maximum quality, and we'll build it for desktop and console. If we're creating the Gear VR version, we would use mobile and tablet, and possibly adjust some of these parameters a bit. But for today, we're just doing this. So now we give our name to our project. So we're going to call this VR Test Scene. But you can call this whatever you want, and not put spaces in the name, like so. So we press Create Project, and we will launch this up. I'm running this off an i7 processor with a GTX 980 Ti graphics card, so performance is quite smooth. So as you see, it gives us a pre-built scene. So before we get into the nitty-gritty on creating a VR scene, it's basically worthwhile to basically give you an introduction into Unreal 4, the reasons why we're using Unreal 4, and basically just some little tips and tricks to get you going quickly. So let's guide you around this. So you see this side here, which we have the modes panel, which gives us a place brush, which gives us options to pre-built established content, which we can basically click with our left mouse button and drag into the world and move around using the arrows. If we wanted to scale it, we can press E or this button up here to rotate the object on the X, Y and Z axis, and the scale button we can use this. If you click on the white square, it'll scale everything proportionately. Otherwise, if you click on one of them, it'll scale that axis. Alternatively, if you want more control, you can use, with the objects selected, with this orange outline to show it's been selected, we have all the options here where we can adjust the scale, we can adjust the rotation of it this way, and so on and so on. So you don't need to do it this way. If you want a more accurate control mechanism, this is preferred. As you see here, we have our static mesh, and within that there is options. So from a blocking volume, which basically means there's a collision pre-built with it, and alongside some textures, which we'll get onto later. So we'll get rid of that for now, and we'll get rid of this chair. To get rid of objects, you just simply click on them, and if you're using a Mac, it's backspace. If you're using a PC, delete to select and delete the objects that it comes with pre-built for you, because we're going to start from scratch with this series. As you see, it leaves the shadows of these objects even though I've removed them. The reason for this is the render engine needs to basically catch up. A way to do this is to rebuild. So we click on the build button up here. This will force changes and an update of the scene. This can take a while, but it won't in this case because we haven't got a very heavily detailed scene at this point in time. So we have things like empty character, which is your player model. We tend to use player start though, because that will give you the pre-built controls ready. In future series videos, we will show you how to custom control this rig, but for now, we'll just get rid of that. Here we have light, so we've got unidirectional, which you won't really see the impact of because we've got a skylight, which is overwriting all that. But if we just get rid of that for a second and rebuild, that should hopefully have some impact. So we go back onto W, which is our move tool, and click on the light. We should now be able to move it. You can't really see it updating in real time. You will be able to later when we're in a darker scene. But directional light, basically the light source points where this white arrow is directing. It's pretty self-explanatory in that sense. So then we have a point light, which is a light that emits light in a radius, which is this blue circle we see here. If we want to adjust that radius, we just adjust down here the attenuation radius in the properties panel, or details as it's described here. We've got various options like use temperature, source length, radius, and etc. etc. There's a lot of options here, and I'm not going to go through them all today. But basically, needless to say, they all have a function and purpose, so review them and experiment is the best way with that. Get rid of that for now. Then we have a spotlight, which is a light that points directly downwards in a cone. We can change the colour of that if we want to, so we can go double click on it, and it brings up a colour picker. So we could go to a nice pink, and it should change that to a pink light. Any model that's lit by a light will be affected by that light's colour reflection, and the shadows will be in tune to where the light source is bouncing back off. So that's kind of already calculated for you, which was one of the reasons why we're utilising Unreal 4. It has a very nice graphical rendering engine. It is freely available, although there is a paid subscription if you're making over, I believe it's £10,000, but you have to double check that. But it's a nice little quick tool, simple drag and drop, just to create something basic, but there are a lot you can do with it using blueprints and C++. And then the skylight, which was in here previously, which is a whole world affecting light, etc. Then we have things like visual effects, so we have box reflections, sphere reflections, fog, etc. etc. Now, the difference between basic shapes, which are these here, and BSPs is a basic shape, as we'll drop a cube in there, as you see, is a texture wrapped around the entire model, whereas a BSP is actually a physically sculpted object in a sense. It's got collisions on it, and we can individually texture each side and panel of it as a different surface. BSP brushes take longer to render, so you don't want to utilize these for everything, but whereas these are static meshes, which basically are optimized and render out a lot quicker. So that's the main distinction between them two for the purposes of now. Then we have volumes. These are, well, if we drag one in, you see it's invisible, but it creates a grid. Now, a blocking volume, which is what we've dragged in here, will basically, if the player walks into it, they'll be walking into essentially an invisible wall. This is useful to have where potentially the camera could clip through a wall, so you'd want to extenuate this orange outline out by a couple of centimeters, etc., in the radius dimension that you want it to. We will look into that later more, but as you see here, there are various collision presets which all have different effects. We have kill volumes, which is if you walk into this collision area, you will die, basically. Pain causing, precomposition, and trigger volumes, which we've utilised with blueprints, mean if you walk into this, we can activate an event upon entry of the player object, or any object that we specify with the same value. So that is the place tool in the modes. So now we'll go on to paint. Paint is essentially if you want to paint a vertices with a brush. We won't be utilising this for the purposes of these videos, but if you want to experiment with these, I would definitely recommend doing so. Then we have landscape. Now, landscape is basically modelling. So if we go on to create new and give it a sec, we'll just keep it as default for now. So as you see, if we zoom wildly out, to zoom in and out, you use your wheel on your mouse, and to move around, well, to keep the camera in one position but look around, right click and drag to your camera around that way. If you keep doing this whilst also holding the arrow buttons, you can navigate around the scene, quite quickly. But we'll zoom out. So if we go on to Sculpt tool, so we've got smooth brushes, erosion, noise, etc, etc. Again, these are quite self-explanatory, but if we go into Sculpt, we'll change the circle to, keep that to a circle, and we'll have a go on that, and we'll just paint onto here. Now what you'll see is as I build up on this, I am essentially adding onto the vertices. So I'm here, for example, I'm building what looks a bit like a hill slash mountain, I suppose. And you can add into that. If we want to take away, it's shift and click, so we can cut away the landscape using the same tool. So click left button to add, shift and left button to remove. Smooth brush is to smooth out any sharp edges, so we can keep it into a sort of fairly level playing field. Flatten flattens everything to the level of where you start the drag. So we'll start this on the original layer, and there we go. You'll see there's a bit of artifacting with the lighting not quite rendering. Again, click and build will fix that. It's just the engine, the graphics card not quite catching up in that sense. Then we have ramps, which sort of are kind of elevated pathways from one point to another, and we'll click add. So there we go. As you see, I dragged a ramp up there, and it's now created a, well, it's pulled the landscape up with a flat edge to the relation of the ramp I've added in there. So if I just click another one in there, drag that down, and then add ramp, it adds a decreasing ramp. It's pretty, again, self-explanatory. Then we have erosion, which, well, basically erodes away at the edges of it. Hydro erosion, which is supposed to simulate the effects of water damage over a surface for a prolonged period of time. Noise, which is just up and down random variations, but we can again adjust the scales and the modes. Retropologize, which is basically it reduces the polygon counts within that area. Visibility. Okay, we can't show the visibility tool because we'll have to assign a material. We'll ignore that for now. So if we go on to paint and we use a paint tool and we go on to this, now we should have. Let's go to the smooth tool there. Okay, paint tool is not currently going to work yet because we need to use some materials and we haven't assigned any yet. So again, we'll go into that potentially in a future video. So then we have the foliage, which is using a foliage brush. I don't know if we've got any foliage we could really use, so I'll have to just pick a prop and we'll pretend that's some trees for this statue. So we use a statue as the paintbrush. Yeah, cool. Foliage type. Click to activate currently selected pattern. So this basically, if we had a tree model in our library, our content browser, which is down here, we could select it as a foliage type, add it in as a model, then paint the brushes in, the models in, if it wants to do it. Do you want to do it? Do you not want to do it? Oh, I'm missing brush size, print density. Okay, doesn't want to have it. Oh, well, it should be added in a minute. It says 544 added. Let's rebuild that and see if that brings it back up with a geometry. Okay, it doesn't seem to want to have it at the moment, but it is rebuilding the lighting. Let's see what that fixes. Yeah, okay, whatever. Don't need to worry about that at the moment. But basically, we could, in theory, paint a forest of trees quite easily with that if we wanted to. Again, for the purposes of these tutorial videos, we'll just be sticking with the place tool and these pre-built established options here. Next, we'll move onto this top bar here, which is our main kind of control system, I suppose, in a sense. We have save, which saves the level that you're currently working on. So if we had multiple levels, we'd save them as different levels within our project window. Source control, which again, if you're using, this is for if you're connecting it to sort of a network kind of server. We have a content, which is this down here. Marketplace, where we can go onto online UE4 store, where you can buy models and packs and extensions. Settings, which gives us the world settings, where we can go into the game mode type, the compatibility, etc., etc. Again, don't want to play about with them too much at the moment. Project settings, which is the name of the object, the logo, thumbnail, the description, and this is what you would need for deployment, alongside all these other options, which we'll go into in a later video. Now, what we need to make sure is you need to go down into your plugins down here, and you ideally want the VR plugin enabled, which I don't seem to have for some reason at the moment. Let's have a look here. Target hardware optimization. There we go, plugins. So we go into plugins here. Advertising media players missing. Virtual reality down there. Okay, right. So we've got the Gear VR plugin enabled, the Oculus input, and all these enabled. You want to keep these enabled if possible. By default, it should enable them. And the Steam VR, which is for the HTC Vive. So that is all correct. There are more plugins you can download, and again, you shouldn't have to mess about with these for the purposes of the workshop materials that we're showing this with, but they're just to let you know they're there, and that's how you would resolve that. Blueprints is where we put in our control systems. So if we want a player to animate in a certain way at a certain point, we would create a blueprint, which is like a daisy chain. So upon the user entering a button or activating a trigger, and a certain action is triggered from that, and then that leads on to what happens within the world, etc. Again, we're not going to touch on that for now. Same with cinematics. Cinematics are basically like a camera that you can pan through the world and create a matinee. It's a if you think of things like Adobe Premiere or After Effects, it's that kind of system where you're animating a camera through a scene, and then you don't have a lot of control. The user doesn't necessarily, but that is essentially what that is. Then we have our build options. Again, we've got options to turn off bit lighting and quality and etc, etc. If your computer is older, I recommend reducing possibly the lighting quality. Same with the build settings where possible. Try and reduce this if your computer is not quite as new as ours is. Then we have our launch devices settings, which again won't show up a lot. In play, you'll notice that the VR preview is turned off at the moment. This is because I haven't got my Oculus DK2 plugged in. Now, if you're creating for virtual reality, you need to have your VR system installed prior to launching your project, which we will do when we actually get onto creating the VR scene. But just to let you know, that's why it's grayed out here, and if yours is grayed out like that, that will be why it's not activated. If your plugin is enabled but your VR preview doesn't give you the option to press it, then it's basically because your VR unit isn't set up correctly on your machine. On how to fix this depends on your device, and we'll look into quickly how to do that in a future video with the Oculus DK2. I would like to show you how to do it on the Vive and the Oculus Consumer Edition in the future, if people want to know how to do that. But for the purposes of testing your scene, we can just happily press the play button. Oh, and we've got a lot of sound there, which is ambient sound, which I will quickly escape from. The ambient sound is just basically what's this here, and we really do not want that, so we'll just get rid of that and we'll try again. So there we go, that's a lot more peaceful. That's better. So as you see, we can fly around because we haven't got a character model in there. We just fly around up, down, left, right, depending on where we look, etc. So this doesn't look any different to the build settings, except this actually is in the game, so collision is working. So if I can't walk through this object, and so on and so on. So we'll escape this. If you want to escape, just press escape, obviously. It makes that really loud metallic noise. Now, so that's basically how this goes. Launch is if you want to deploy it on the final device, which is something you do at the end. So now we'll go into this window here, which is our development/game preview window. And if we go to our drop down here, we've got the options for real time, show stats, show FPS. These are good settings to turn on if you're actually actively doing game development or creating a really used object. Same with field of view is quite useful, etc. Again, I don't tend to play about much with them, to be honest, but they are useful and they are things that you'll turn on and off as you go through quite often as you get further into it. So here we have our perspective view, which is the view that we control, or we can go on to orthographic, which is a flat from above view. Now you'll notice it's turned it into wireframe mode. If we want to turn it back to how it looked before, we can go on to lit, and this is our lit world from above, but it shows us the grid that's enabled. Again, we'll look into that in a second. Or we can go to bottom view, which is just going to be black because there's no lighting from underneath. Left, which is a side-on view from the left. Again, this will probably be wireframe by default. Same with the right, the front, and the back. We'll keep it on perspective. If we want to change how the views are, like we've just quickly seen, we've got lit mode, which is the lighting actually in real-time rendering. Unlit, which turns off the lighting, so it looks all very monochromatic-y style, I suppose. So you don't have shadows, you don't have real-time dynamic lighting enabled. Then we have wireframe, which is very useful for development purposes, so you can sort of accurately see the polygon count and how things are intersecting with each other. Detail lighting, which is how the lighting is sort of impacting on the world. Lighting only, which is again will look very similar for the time being. Lighting complexity, which will change the colour of the world depending on how much light is impacting on an object. So if we point a point light in, we'll see it's hitting these areas here, which is why they're lighting up lighter than the dark areas there. We can go to shader complexity, which is again how it's all rendering in the shades. Light overlaps. Density, so these blue grids reflect on how much light is sort of impacting upon the topology of the object. So as you see here, we have the cubes quite close together, which means if you put a texture on here, the texture will be a lot more close, I suppose, in that sense. Whereas if we overlay the same texture onto this terrain, with the squares being so much larger, the terrain quality material would stretch, so the quality would be reduced. But for the purposes of a massive world, you don't necessarily want highly detailed textures everywhere. Then we've got reflections, which will make everything look all chrome. It's just basically how things reflect off each other. There isn't really a lot of use for that. LOD, which is level of detail coloration, how much we can see actively with our rendering before it starts to cop out a little bit. Collisions and visibility collisions, etc, etc. But we'll keep it on lit mode, which is Alt F4. And if we want to turn things on and off, we've got the show options here, so we can turn off the BSP brushes, and we can turn on and off the landscape. Basically, if you just don't want to see a certain thing and you just want to concentrate on a particular area, we can toggle it on and off here. Same with lighting and other cameras and other volumes, etc, etc. As we touched on earlier, we've got the select object position. So we've got translate locations, which gives up this little 4 grid. As you see here, it's highlighting them and highlighting them here with the orange outline. We've got the rotate, which is the E, and we have the scale with the R. Don't need to press that one. So then we have the snapping option, so we can snap things to a surface, which I turned off for the purposes of this. And we can also turn on and off the grid. The grid you won't really see from here because we have this massive landscape in the way. So if I just get rid of the landscape for a second and zoom in, we can, if we click on this object here, we turn on the grid and then move them around, we should see a grid-like view. I don't seem to want to. Oh, it enables the snap and disables the snap into grid. So if here it will snap to the grid, if we turn that off, it will just be free. Then we've got the snap amount, so we can snap to every 1 block in the grid, or we can snap it to every 5,000, which is more dramatic movement, as you see, or 500, same difference. Same with the rotations and the scales. Then we've got the camera speed, which is how fast the camera moves when we do this. By default, it's 4. Then we can also maximize or restore the viewpoint by clicking on that button there. If we click on that button, it opens up a 4 view, which gives us a left, a front, and a top view in a wireframe mode, which can be useful. If we just want to go back to one view, we click on that little corner box and it takes us back to that view in full screen. So now we'll move on to the World Outliner. Now the World Outliner outlines everything that's within this scene at the moment. So we've got our floor, our fog camera, player starts, etc. So if we want to go to that object, we can just double click on it on there and it takes it to us, and it's outlined in orange, as you see. Same with the reflection capture and atmospheric fogs, etc. Now, because this is a default scene, it's got all these included, but you can have an empty scene and none of this would be here, just so you know. And it also, whenever we click on an object, it gives us the different options for that object down here in the details panel. So this is the different options that each object have. Some objects like lights will have like bloom effects and tints, whereas objects such as models will not. And got player starts, which shows, etc., etc. Same with volumes, etc. You know, play about with this. You can't really screw it up too much. The best way to learn with Unreal 4 is to experiment. As long as you don't play about with the settings too much or the blueprints and these kind of important free up here, I suppose, you can't really screw up on Unreal 4 that easily. So now we've got our content browser down here, which we can lock if we want to, or unlock, and our view options, which we can change the view of how this is shown to us, so we can have it bigger or smaller. By default, it goes in a tiles view like this. So if we click on our starter content, which is a double click with the left mouse button, and the pre-built starter pack, I suppose, gives us an architecture, blueprints, maps, materials, and props, etc. So if we go into props, and if let's say we want a bench in here or a couch, so we just drag it into the world, and then we can zoom in, and you see it's put it in there. The most important thing I kind of stipulate on is to check if the models are overlapping the real world or not. If they are, it might just be the snap sizes that are on, so we might have to play about that a bit. So you just keep playing about it until it just touches. We can move that back a bit. We could give that a little slight jaunty angle. Scale that down a bit if we wanted to. So this is all things we'll cover more detail in the actual development videos. Then we've got materials. So these are materials for the props in there. If we go back to start content, which is for this navigation chain up here, and go to materials, these are the content materials that it comes pre-built with the start pack. So if we want to give our floor, which is currently a metal floor, a nice wooden texture, we just drag the wood onto the floor there. As you see, it adds it in. So there we go. It's as simple as that. Because this is a BS, well, is this a BSP brush or is this a volume brush? I believe this is a static mesh, so it's a volume. Because this is a volume, it applies the texture to all sides, but if we had this as a BSP box, and because I've got that material selected, it's put all the panels on that. But if I now click off, grab a material, let's say this high-tech pulse, and drag it on, it'll only drag it on, only apply that material onto the one side we've got selected. Same with this side, and put some grass on there, etc., etc. So you see that how we can quickly change the different surfaces and sides quite easily, but we'll get rid of that for now. Again, we'll cover this in more detail in the actual main content. Now, if you want to add content to this area, you simply drag it in. So we'll go onto desktop here. We'll go into our desktop view, which is here. What can we drag in as a test? We're dragging this picture here. We drag it until we've got the little plus symbol appears, then drag it in and let go. There we go, it adds it in, so that's now added in as a texture. If we want to make that into a material, we right click on it, and we've got the texture action, so we can press create material. We can rename that if we want to, but I'm not going to. If we want a sprite, we'll create a sprite this way, and there we go. Now we'll show the differences between these three quickly. So a texture is something that we sort of, you don't need to be all about textures really. We'll be working with materials and sprites for this workshop. So a material is like we've seen already with the wooden floor, we just drag it on, it puts it onto there like that. As you see, the scale is set to the squares that was on this texture already and the orientation of it. So that's how a material works. If a sprite, however, we drag that in like this, and basically it's like a flat panel image. Now it's worth noting that if that image contains transparency, the transparency is retained. So if we drag this tree in, which is a .png with a transparent background, and then we create that as a sprite, and then drag that into the world, as you see, it retained the outline to the shape without the background. This is a good way of doing things like signs or kind of logos. So we can kind of put that in like that. This also has some collision, but so we can scale that down and scale it up. It's a bit fiddly actually, so we'll use the scale options here. So we go to 0.2. 0.2 and 0.2. There we go. We can move that down. Get a disk that's too big for now for the purpose of showing this off. We can zoom in and we have our little tree as a sprite. So that's basically a quick outline of how these little windows work. We'll go through this step by step in the actual workshop materials. I just wanted to sort of quickly get to know how this works quickly. If we want to save, we go to File, Save. And that saves it as the name we've already done when we created the project, or we can do Save As and give it a new name, which we're not going to do for this, and etc. etc. We can create a new project. We can change the package type, so we can package it for Windows, Linux, iOS, HTML, Android, etc. etc. But again, these ones tend to work differently, which we will possibly cover in future videos. If you made a mistake at any point, you can go to Undo History, which gives you a list of all the history changes. That won't show up because I've just cleared that by pressing a shortcut on my computer. And then we have all the window views here, so we can add in different windows if we want to, show all the levels, show the statistics, etc. etc. Again, don't worry too much about that. If at any point you get stuck, there are tutorials within Unreal 4. And there is all online material such as the wiki and the documentation, which basically give you guide and advice. And if you need an answer, you can go onto the forums and Answer Hub to basically ask other developers and other users. So I hope this kind of gives you a quick oversight on how Unreal 4 kind of works and the essential quick setup and launch of the application. Remember, to use the VR scene, you need to have your VR unit plugged in prior to launching Unreal 4. And we'll cover that in another video. Thank you very much for watching.